William J. Seymour was born on May 2, 1870, in Centerville, Louisiana, to Simon and Phyllis Seymour, both of whom had been freed from slavery after the Civil War. Growing up in the post-Reconstruction South, Seymour encountered the harsh realities of poverty and segregation, yet, even as a child, he displayed a quiet resilience and a deep desire for something greater. Though little is known about his parents' personal beliefs, Seymour developed a strong spiritual curiosity that seemed to drive him beyond the constraints of his circumstances. This sense of a higher calling would shape his life and lead him to a pivotal role in shaping the Pentecostal movement. At around the age of 25, Seymour left Louisiana and headed to larger cities in search of both work and spiritual fulfillment. He eventually settled in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he encountered the Holiness Movement, a growing movement within Methodist circles that emphasized personal sanctification, purity, and a deep, personal relationship with God. The Holiness Movement had been gaining momentum since the mid-19th century, largely influenced by key leaders such as Phoebe Palmer and John Wesley, whose teachings on Christian perfection and sanctification through the Holy Spirit resonated with many. The Holiness Movement focused on the idea that believers could experience a second blessing or sanctification that empowered them to live a life free from willful sin. This emphasis on personal holiness and spiritual empowerment deeply influenced Seymour's developing faith. Though he lacked formal theological training, Seymour's exposure to these teachings ignited his desire for a transformative experience with the Holy Spirit. In the late 1890s, Seymour joined a small holiness church in Indianapolis, where he began to deepen his understanding of faith. Although there is no record of him having formal schooling beyond elementary education, Seymour's earnest pursuit of spiritual knowledge led him to study the Bible extensively. His experiences in the Holiness Movement, which encouraged believers to seek a deeper, more personal connection with God, began to shape his view of Christianity and the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of a believer. Around 1905, at the age of 35, Seymour moved to Houston, Texas, where he encountered Charles Fox Parham, a key figure in the Pentecostal movement and the founder of Bethel Bible School in Topeka, Kansas. Parham was known for his teaching that speaking in tongues was the biblical evidence of receiving the Holy Spirit, a concept that captivated Seymour. Although racial segregation laws in Texas prevented Seymour from sitting inside the classroom, he listened to Parham's teachings from outside the door and absorbed the principles that would later define his ministry. Seymour's time in Houston was pivotal. Parham's teachings on the baptism of the Holy Spirit deeply resonated with him, particularly the idea that this spiritual experience should be accompanied by speaking in tongues. Convinced of this truth, Seymour became determined to spread this message, and by early 1906, he left Texas for Los Angeles, California, where his future ministry would take shape. Seymour arrived in Los Angeles with high hopes, but initially faced rejection. After being invited to preach at a small holiness congregation, he was locked out of the church after his first sermon on the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. Undeterred, Seymour began holding small prayer meetings in a private home on Bonnie Brace Street, where a few faithful attendees gathered to seek a fresh outpouring of God's Spirit. On April 9, 1906, something extraordinary happened. During one of these prayer meetings, Jenny Moore, one of the attendees, began to speak in tongues, an event that Seymour and the others interpreted as a sign that they had received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. This event marked the beginning of what would become the Azusa Street Revival, a spiritual movement that would shape the future of Christianity in profound ways. As the prayer meetings grew in intensity, more people flocked to the gatherings, and soon the small home on Bonnie Brace Street could no longer accommodate the crowds. Seymour and his followers relocated to a vacant building at 312 Azusa Street, where the revival would continue to grow. The Azusa Street Mission, as it became known, was a humble, run-down structure, yet it became the focal point of a global movement. The Azusa Street Revival was characterized by spontaneous, spirit-led worship services, where people of all races and backgrounds gathered together. This breaking down of racial and social barriers was a radical departure from the norms of the time, especially in a deeply segregated society. The revival attracted people from all over the world, including missionaries, pastors, and ordinary believers who were hungry for a deeper experience with God. At the heart of the revival was the practice of speaking in tongues, which many saw as the biblical sign of being filled with the Holy Spirit. Seymour, who remained humble and unassuming throughout, was not the focal point of the meetings. Instead, he encouraged attendees to focus on their personal experience with God. Seymour often sat behind the pulpit with his head bowed in prayer, allowing the Holy Spirit to guide the services. News of the revival spread quickly, and people traveled from near and far to experience the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Azusa Street. The services, which often lasted for hours, were filled with reports of miraculous healings, prophecies, and other manifestations of the Spirit. The atmosphere was one of intense spiritual fervor, and many attendees left the meetings transformed, eager to spread the Pentecostal message to their own communities. The revival at Azusa Street continued for several years, from 1906 to around 1915. During this time, many Pentecostal denominations were formed, as people who had been impacted by the revival went on to establish churches that embraced the teachings of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. The revival also had a lasting impact on the global Christian community, as missionaries who had attended the meetings carried the Pentecostal message to countries around the world, including Africa, Europe, and Asia. Despite the growth and success of the Pentecostal movement, the Azusa Street Revival faced its share of challenges. Internal disagreements, financial struggles, and external criticism all took their toll on the mission. By 1915, the revival had begun to wane, though its impact would continue to be felt for decades to come. Seymour himself continued to serve as the pastor of the Azusa Street Mission until his health began to decline. He suffered from various ailments, including high blood pressure and heart problems, yet he remained dedicated to his calling. Seymour's later years were marked by a quieter ministry, as he continued to preach and pastor a smaller congregation in Los Angeles. On September 28, 1922, William J. Seymour passed away at the age of 52. Though he did not live to see the full extent of Pentecostalism's global growth, his legacy endured. The Pentecostal movement, which had its roots in the Azusa Street Revival, went on to become one of the fastest-growing segments of Christianity in the 20th and 21st centuries. Seymour's teachings on the baptism of the Holy Spirit, the importance of speaking in tongues, and the unity of believers across racial and social lines continue to influence Pentecostal and charismatic churches worldwide. The movement that began in a modest mission on Azusa Street has spread to millions of believers across the globe, a testament to the enduring power of the message that Seymour helped to ignite.